bud density is what I want to get into next. Another article you wrote, it was something very interesting, really popped out at me. You mentioned that light schedule can impact bud density. Can you
Yeah,
explain?
yeah. I think there's two papers now, publications that show this, but essentially, like, so for many years, we just went under the kind of the metric of 18 hours of light during veg, 12 hours during flower, right? But I always like thought, like, well, why 12 hours? Like, it seems like if it's just 12 hours that activates flowering, then that seems awful close to the line to pick 12 hours, right? So actually, it must be higher than that. And from what I can gather, if you averaged it out, like, when is the actual flowering time initiated? If you averaged it out between a lot of the varieties that we had data for, we found it was 13.5 hours, right? So most of them would be triggered into flowering at 13 and a half hours of light, not 12, right? So what these studies did was they took some of the plants that actually flowered under slightly longer days, like 14 and a half hours. So they did like a 14 10 schedule. They did like a 12-12. Then they did a 10-14 schedule in the opposite way. And what they measured was like, how that changed the morphology of the buds. And essentially what happened was the shorter the amount of daytime, the smaller and fatter the buds were, and the longer. So, but it seemed like 12-12 was kind of the sweet spot, believe it or not. Like, again, it would be variety specific. But what they found was if you want like a good balance between elongation and fattening, then you'd probably hit 12-12. What's interesting is a couple of buddies. One of them, shout out to Stuart Maxwell up in Vancouver. He done a few interesting things, and he would augment the time. So we'd use 12-12 to initiate flowering. Then we'd push it up to 13 and a half hours of light for 3 or 4 weeks to give it that extra photosynthetic activity. Then he would dial it back down to finish it. But what I've come to realise, and one of my personal tips is to dial it all the way down in the finishing weeks after you've had your boost week, your big bloom onset, when you get most of your mass coming through after the kind of. So like in my head, flowering follows this pattern. If it's 10 week flowering, for example, you'll have 5 weeks of, oh yeah, look at this, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Then you have 2 or 3 weeks of just boom, fattening out. Like, now it's starting to gain some weight, and then that last few weeks doesn't look like much is happening. But what's generally happening in my mind is getting density, right? So if I follow that pattern and I apply it to what we were talking about controlling the light to control the shape of the bud, then what I tend to do is in that after that boom phase, that 2 or 3 weeks of boom phase between 5 and 8, I tend to dial it right down. So I'll go 10 hours light, and then what you see is that finish, that density there at the end, whereas normally it finishes on 12-12, it just really comes through. And that goes, there's evidence there on the publications to show that happens under that. But rather than do like a full cycle under one or the other, why not change it throughout? I actually I really like to stagger the transition as well. It's another little crop steering trick as well. If you go from 18 hours of light straight into 12 hours of light, you tend to have a little bit of couple of days of the plant going, whoa, what's going on? Figure this out. Right, okay, I'm away. If you kind of graduate it down, I find that the plant tends to transition much smoother, and we get where we want to be a little bit quicker. Um, Again, is that a scientific claim? Not really. It's just an observation thing. Whenever I do that, and you can be quite extreme. You can take two hours off every other day, but just do some kind of incremental decrease towards 12. I prefer to do it like maybe over 2 weeks, and just like slowly, like, an hour or so a day, give or take. Some days you won't do it. Doesn't really need to. If you've got a good programmable LED, you can automate it to go from this to that over this amount of time, which would be the ideal way of doing it, because it just mimics a natural thing. Because one of the big things that we learn from this plant is the autumning phase is really, of the fall, you guys call it, right? The fall phase of a plant's life is really important, especially to the finish of this plant. So in the fall, we get less daytime as well as drop in temperature, right? But whenever we're talking about getting colour or getting a nice finish, we don't often talk about the light. We only talk about dropping the temperature generally and giving only water, for example. So starve the plant a little bit and you take away its temperature, well, why would you not go all the way and then reduce the light as well? Because that has an effect on how it finishes. And my experience tells me that I wouldn't not do that. Let's put it that way.
This clip is brought to you by AC Infinity. Use discount code MrGrow at 15 to save on any of their products.